Okay, class, part 2 of chapter 1, cardiac anatomy and physiology lecture. Let's do a quick recap of what we discussed yesterday in our lecture. As we know, the heart is a muscular organ. Did you also know that this miraculous organ is the only organ that can pretty much function on its own? Whenever a person is considered brain dead, the only reason why they're on life support is so it can breathe for them. Because remember, the circulation of the heart, it takes deoxygenated blood, pushes it back into the lungs for the lungs to oxygenate it, and brings it back into the heart to distribute throughout the body. So without the use of our lungs, our heart cannot do its job properly. So that old folk tale where they say, oh, a person has taken their last breath, they're not expired at that time. It just means they're taking their last deep inhaled breath. They're not considered expired until that last heartbeat, the last time the heart is able to pump out any blood. We also know that the reason why this miraculous organ, which is called the heart, is so good is because it pumps out blood throughout the entire body so it can serve and work, and we can run, jump, play, sleep, even your heart beats still while you're sleeping. But without this organ, we cannot function. We also know that this heart is located in the thoracic cavity, which is above the diaphragm and behind the septum, but in front of the vertebrae. That it lays slightly to the left. We also going to recall that the base of the heart is the top portion of the heart, and that the apex is at the bottom pointy part that points to the left. Now remember, we're looking at a flat surface of the heart. So if you want to get a better picture, turn your body physically around and think of it that way. So if you turn your body to the left, you will see that the apex is really pointing towards the left side of your chest, and that the base kind of sits catacorner, like so, in your chest. We also know that the heart is made up of 3 layers. We have the endocardium, the myocardium, and the epicardium. The endocardium is the innermost layer, where the myocardium is our muscular layer, which this is responsible for the pumping action of your heart. Then you have your epicardium. Your heart is surrounded and protected by the pericardium. In between the pericardium and the epicardium is what we call the pericardium fluid, which is so. This is our pericardium fluid, which is located in the pericardial canal. Now, as you know, our heart is broken down into 4 chambers. We have our right atrium, our right ventricle, our left atrium, and our left ventricle. We know that the right side is the receiver of deoxygenated blood, which comes from our great vessel called the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. We know that the oxygen levels at this time, once it's received into the right ventricle, is anywhere from 60 to 75%, meaning it's almost no more oxygen. It has a very, very high concentration of CO2. CO2 is the chemical name for carbon dioxide. Next, we'll talk about our right ventricle. Our right ventricle pumps blood into the lungs by the left pulmonary artery and by the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery. Remember, the pulmonary artery is the only artery, repeat, the only artery that will receive what? deoxygenated blood or oxygen poor blood, which has come into the right ventricle. Once the blood has left from the right and left pulmonary artery, it will go into the lungs and come back through the right and left pulmonary vein. Now remember, the pulmonary veins are the only veins in the human body that will receive what? Oxygen rich blood, which will then transfer into your right atrium. Your left atrium, I'm sorry. From your left atrium, oxygen rich blood then travels down into your left ventricle, which we consider this our most major pumping chamber due to the fact to where, guess what? It's gonna pump out and go into our atria, which is our largest artery that we have in the human body, is your atria. So it goes from the atria and down into the descending atria. This is what we call the descending atria. Now, in order to separate the right from the left, our right and our left side of the heart, we have a tissue called the septum. To separate our right atrium from our left atrium, we call that the intraatrial septum. To separate our right ventricle from our left ventricle, we call that the intraventricular septum. The whole membrane which separates the two sides is called the septum. As we recapped before, there are 5 great vessels, which are all located at the top part of the heart, which the top part of the heart is called what? The base. So we have our right pulmonary artery, our right pulmonary vein, our superior vena cava, our inferior vena cava. We also have our aorta, our left pulmonary artery, our left pulmonary vein. As blood goes from all these major organs, our great vessels, they are controlled by 4 valves that are in your heart. We have 2 different kinds of valves. We have semilunar valves and we have atrioventricular valves, or AV valves. We have our tricuspid, our pulmonic valve, our aortic valve, our mitral or bicuspid valve. See here? Now we're going to trace the blood flow of the heart. I'm going to take a blue pen and I'm going to trace out how the blood flows throughout the heart. As you know, from the upper body, deoxygenated blood goes into your superior vena cava, and from the lower body, blood will travel into our inferior vena cava. In the back of the heart, these two connect to the right atrium, where it is pumped into. This is your deoxygenated blood. All this time, your tricuspid is closed as your blood is filling up in your right atrium. Once blood has reached to its max in its right atrium, the tricuspid valve will pop open and allow deoxygenated blood to flow into the right ventricle. Once blood has entered into the right ventricle, it flows from the right atrium down into the right ventricle, and it keeps flowing until it fills up. Once the right ventricle fills, it automatically poof, will close the tricuspid valves so the blood doesn't backflow back into the right atrium. Now, as you know, some people have what we call valve leakage or valve problems. That's because one of their major valves cannot close properly. So, what is happening is they're getting a backflow of blood that shouldn't be backflowing back where it belongs. Everything has to continuously move in a forward motion. So, once your right ventricle fills, guess where it's going? It's going through, it pushes open the pulmonic valve so it can travel, deoxygenated blood can travel to your right, your left, and your right pulmonary, what? Artery. Because remember, this is the only artery that will give you deoxygenated blood. Once your pulmonary artery will supply blood into your lungs, and you'll take a breath, and you'll have, let's switch pens. Now we have oxygen rich, because remember, when blood is rich in oxygen, it has a red color. It will travel into here, your left and your right, what? Pulmonary veins. So you got oxygen rich blood traveling from your right and your left pulmonary veins going into your left atrium. So now we're waiting for the left side to fill. Once the left side fills, all this time while it's filling, your bicuspid valve is closed. So as it fills up, it's going to push open your bicuspid valve, allowing blood to transfer into your left ventricle. As your left ventricle opens, your bicuspid valve is slowly closing back, shut. Close it shut. Once it fills up, it pops open your aortic valve, which will travel and go up into your aorta, where blood is distributed out through the upper part of your body, all the way down to your descending aorta, which covers your lower part of your body. And this is how blood flows through your heart. So remember, that base is your most important part of your heart. Why? Because it is responsible for everything that goes on in your heart. So if we were to do a flow chart, it would look like this. From your superior or inferior vena cava, goes into your right atrium, through your tricuspid valve to the to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it goes into your lungs. From there, it goes to the pulmonary valve, through the pulmonary artery to your lungs. From your lungs, it goes into the pulmonary veins, to the left atrium, through the bicuspid or mitral valve, through the left ventricle, through the aortic valve, through the aorta, down into the body. This is what we call the systematic circulation of the heart. systematic circulation of the heart. As we talked about yesterday earlier, also is the cardiac cycle, or what we call the systole diastole area, where you get the love dove, the S1 and the S2. As you know, there are two phases of cardiac cycle. There is the diastole and the systole. Systole is the period during which the chamber is contracting and blood is being ejected. Systole includes contraction of both atrial and ventricular muscle. Diastole is the period of relaxation during which the chambers are allowed to fill. The myocardium, remember, this is the muscular part of the heart, where it receives its first supply of oxygenated blood from the circulatory organs during ventricular diastole. Because remember, how does the heart get its own blood supply? Yes, it is a major organ that can pretty much work on its own, but guess what? It's pumping out blood. So where, in order for the body to function, but how does it get blood in order to function? Well, we have these cardiac blood vessels. So while the heart is in its relaxation mode, it gets blood through these cardiac veins. The cardiac cycle, which is the pressure within each chamber, remember there are 4 chambers of the heart, which rises in systole and falls in diastole. The heart valves ensure that the blood flows in the proper direction. There are 3 different phases to diastole. You have the rapid filling phase, which is the first phase of diastole. This is when the aorta is receiving blood from the superior and inferior vena cava. Then you have the diastolis, which is the second phase of diastole. This is when the pressure in the atria and the ventricles are starting to equalize as the ventricles fill and the aorta is empty. Then you have the atrial kick, where is the last phase of diastole, where the atrium is almost empty, but it gets a little shove, one last major contraction from the atrium to dump out the last little bit of blood into the ventricle. This is when the ventricles are at its highest peak, and it also allows the AV valve, which is your tricuspid, to close. This is what we call RS1 sound. Phases of systole. You have 4 different phases of systole. You have the isovolumetric contraction, which is the first phase of systole. This is when the ventricles are filled and the pressure in them is not high enough to exceed the pressure for the semilunar valve to open. But this phase results in the greatest compression of myocardial oxygen. Then you have the ventricular ejection, which is the second phase of systole. In this phase, the ventricular pressure has reached its highest point for the semilunar valves to pop open, allowing the blood to rush out into the aorta and pulmonary arteries. So our semilunar valves are our pulmonic valve, which is here, and our aortic valve. Those are what we call our semilunar valves or half moon valves. Our AV valves are our tricuspid and our bicuspid. Our tricuspid has 3 cuspids, where our bicuspid only has 2 cuspids. hence tricuspid and bicuspid. Our third phase of systole is called aportal distole, where ventricular contraction continues, allowing blood to flow at a slow pace, which causes a drop in ventricular rhythm or ventricular pressure. Once this occurs, the pressure in the aortic and pulmonary atrial increases. Pressure is then equalized between the ventricle and the aorta and pulmonary artery. Our final phase of systole is called our isovolumetric relaxation. This is where ventricular pressure is at an all-time low, all the blood has been pumped out, and the ventricles are starting to relax, which causes a